Hi everyone, thanks very much for joining. So we'll just start things off with a quick agenda, if I can get onto the next slide. So this is the agenda for the webinar today. So we'll start off with a very brief introduction to Portland Analytics, just go through who we are and what we do. We've then got a section, kind of a broad overview of HVO, so just a bit of explanation of what is the product, what are the different types of HVO, and what benefits can you get from using it. Geraint's then going to talk us through his experiences of transitioning from diesel over to HVO back in his previous role. And then in the kind of second section of the webinar, I'll go through in a little bit more detail around things like supply chain. So how can you get hold of it? Where does it come from? And obviously, very importantly, how much it's going to cost you. And then we've got a few kind of recommendations and considerations around implementation. So if you are going to look at transitioning across from diesel to HVO, what are the things that you need to bear in mind for when you're doing that? And then we've got a Q&A section at the end. So just a very brief introduction to Portland Analytics. So we're a specialist fuel consultancy. So we work with major fuel buyers on an advisory basis. So we help with things like procurement strategy, on things like on both traditional fuels and alternative fuels as well. We also have an online fuel price information service, which we partner with FORS to give that to their operators. So that provides transparent pricing information on kind of a range of different purchase methods and products. So diesel and HVO are included in that. In terms of HVO, so we've got quite a bit of experience on this side of things. So we've done a lot of research and reporting for clients that are interested in kind of learning more about the product, right the way through to developing full alternative fuel strategies for businesses. And that can include going out to tender as well. So we've done quite a few managed HVO tenders where we go out to market to try and source supply. Our pricing service is used by more than 300 companies in the UK, and that includes a section on HVO pricing. And we're part of the wider Portland group. So that's been going almost 15 years, started out as a hedging provider. We've also got a physical fuel business as well. So we're kind of very well experienced in the full sort of downstream sector. So I will start things off with just a bit of an overview of HVO. So yes, the first question is, broadly, what is HVO? So it's essentially just another type of diesel, but instead of being made from crude oil, which is obviously a fossil fuel, it's made from sustainable feedstocks. So I think the term HVO, so that stands for Hydrotreated Vegetable Oil, is a little bit misleading, as it implies that all HVO comes from vegetable oil, which it doesn't. There's actually a range of feedstocks that can be used to create the end product. So that includes oil crops, so things like sunflower oil, rapeseed oil, soybean, through to waste products like used cooking oil and animal fats, so tallow. There's also a product that's been used in the last couple of years called POME, which is palm oil mill effluent. And rather than being pure palm oil, which obviously isn't a particularly sustainable feedstock, the waste product that comes from the palm oil production process, POME, is actually considered a waste product and is therefore used in the production of HVO. So you might see HVO actually referred to as HEFA, which is hydroprocessed esters and fatty acids. Not a particularly catchy title, but it's a more all-encompassing term, so it kind of covers not just the vegetable oil feedstocks that go into it, but the full kind of range. Or you might just see it referred to as renewable diesel, which is a much simpler kind of title. So feedstocks, I'm going to talk about this in more detail on the next slide, but they are really important because they affect the GHG savings of the final product. So very simply put, HVO produced from a waste feedstock has a better GHG saving than an HVO produced from a crop feedstock. So it is really crucial to kind of hammer home this point about feedstocks. And it also affects price, because greater greater GHG savings, there's higher demand for those products. So it does affect price.
So we're talking greenhouse gas, are we? GHG?
Yeah, sorry,
right.
GHG, greenhouse gas.
Yeah.
So you'll see greenhouse gas emissions savings, and it's usually compared against diesel, which is the fossil comparator. The one thing that all HEFA HVO fuels have in common, regardless of feedstock, is that they are a lower GHG alternative to fossil diesel. Not just diesel as well, but also kerosene. So you can use it in a diesel engine. You can use it as a gas oil replacement in a commercial boiler. You can use it as a kero replacement in a domestic heating boiler. So in terms of the benefits, HVO basically has a very similar chemical makeup to traditional diesel, which means that it can be used as a direct replacement for diesel in an engine without having to modify it. So clearly this makes it a very easy transitional fuel. So not only can you put it straight into a diesel vehicle, but you can also, if you have bulk diesel stored in tank, you can actually mix HVO in the tank if you don't want to go down the route of having a dedicated HVO tank. Yeah, like I say, you can have half a tank of diesel in your vehicle, and you can top it up with HVO, and it should run fine. I guess the one caveat to that is that you should check that with your vehicle manufacturer. So HVO meets a different spec to standard diesel. So the spec for HVO is EN 15940, which is the spec for paraffinic diesel. So if you are raising this with your vehicle manufacturer, the question to ask is, will you still warranty me for the use of paraffinic diesels in the vehicle? Particularly in older vehicles, it's worth checking that. So I mentioned about GHG emissions. So the point 2 on there talks about life cycle GHG emissions, and WTW stands for well to wheel, which is effectively the full production process, right the way from sourcing the feedstock all the way to actually getting it into the vehicle itself. The chart on the right shows your GHG savings against traditional fossil diesel, and you can see there that the top 5 categories, so these are your crop categories, they do have GHG savings against diesel, but they're not as high as the waste-based feedstocks at the bottom, so tallow, pommy, and the highest GHG savings that you're going to get is from a used cooking oil product. So it's quite high demand for used cooking oil based HVO, particularly in Europe and definitely in the UK, which I'll come on to on the next slide. As well as life cycle GHG emissions reductions, you also have a reduction in your tailpipe emissions, so what actually comes out of the exhaust. And for those of you that are buying a lot of AdBlue, the good news is with HVO, because of the reduced tailpipe emissions, it means that your AdBlue consumption would actually come down as well. One of the questions that often comes up is, how does HVO compare against other biodiesels? So you might be aware that standard diesel that's sold in the UK is up to a 7% biodiesel blend. So if you look at a petrol pump, a diesel pump, you'll see that it says B7 on it. That's the standard spec in the UK. Which means you can blend traditional biodiesel up to 7%. Anything higher than that, with traditional first generation biofuels, there can be issues around waxing in cold weather. And this is because they have a higher cold filter plugging point than HVO. So anything above B7, so that's B10, you might see B15, B20, right the way up to B100. If you're going down that route, then you have to consider things like how cold is it where you're going to store that fuel, and in some cases you would need like a heated storage tank and that kind of thing. HVO has a much lower cold filter plug-in point than traditional first gen biofuels, so at least -15, possibly more in some cases, which means that you can use it safely, blended up to 100%, providing that the CFPP kind of meets the requirement for wherever you're located. So in terms of performance, you've got a higher cetane number, a lower CFPP, and also a lower density than diesel, which all kind of adds up to things like improved starting performance, cleaner combustion, and better performance in cold weather. Although in terms of fuel economy, because it's slightly less dense, that can affect the fuel economy of the of HVO. However, the other benefits can often offset that. So we've had certain reports that say it can be the same as diesel in terms of fuel economy. It could be slightly worse off, or it might even be better. So it's tricky to give kind of an exact answer there. And I know Geraint will talk a little bit about his experience in the next section. But you know, the takeaway there is test it in your vehicles if you want to, before you commit to go into full HVO and you want to know about fuel economy and that kind of thing. It's always worth just testing it first.
Hey, Mike,
one other
I'm
thing
just going to interject for a second. Sorry, you probably can't see the chat, but we've got some questions coming through, which is really great. I'll leave some for you to answer at the end in the dedicated Q&A section. However, a couple are just relevant to this slide. So the first one that I think will be good is, what is CFPP?
Okay, so that's the cold filter plugging point. So that's how cold can the fuel get before it starts to wax. So a traditional biodiesel might have a CFPP of up to -10 degrees, so it starts to wax after getting to -10, whereas HVO would start to wax at a lower temperature, so -15 and below.
Cool. The next question I think would be good to answer is, can you use additives to combat the cold?
In terms of using it within first generation biodiesel, yeah, I'm aware that there are additives out there that can sort of counteract that factor. I would say in HVO it's probably less relevant really, because it's already got a low enough CFPP that would mean that you wouldn't really need that. But yes, I am aware that there are additives out there that can combat the waxing in first gen biodiesel.
Great. And then what is it cetane number also? Is that how you pronounce it?
Cetane number.
Thank you.
Yeah, so that, I mean, Geraint, can you chip in on that one? Because I think you were talking about this the other day.
Yeah, the cetane is interesting how different people have different experiences. Like cetane rating is a bit like an octane rating in a fuel, and having your unleaded or your super unleaded. Now, some people have reported slightly poorer fuel economy, but we actually had an improvement. When I get to my slide, I'll give you a bit more of an intro, but the cetane rating, the specific density of HVO is lower. Bizarrely, you can actually carry more on the vehicle because it is actually lighter. But in terms of operational performance, from my own I was running 44-ton Arctics, and I had a slight improvement, and it did use less AdBlue. But I'll come on to that on my slide.
Thank you. The other questions, we'll probably save them to the end of the webinar, so stay tuned. But some really good questions coming through about if palm oil is ethical. So yeah, we'll touch on those at the end. Thank you.
Cool. Yeah, sorry, I can't see the questions, so with the slides on. So yeah, Holly, please chip in if there are irrelevant ones again.
I will.
So yeah, I think just the final thing to mention on this slide, one of just preempting a potential question. So there are other types of paraffinic diesel, and one that you may have come across is a product called GTL, gas to liquid. So one question is, how does GTL compare against HVO? And whilst GTL does have similar benefits, the feedstock that goes into GTL is natural gas. So your life cycle emissions or the GHG savings are lower than you get with an HVO fuel, because basically the primary feedstock is still a fossil fuel. It's natural gas. So just a couple of charts to kind of illustrate what this is all added up to. HVO has massively surged in popularity over the last few years, and that's because of the benefits that we just discussed, and it's because of the ease of transition as well. So you can see there that latest figures published by the Department for Transport in 2023 are showing that demand has now surpassed 500 million litres. And obviously, we haven't had figures for 2024 yet, but you'd imagine that trajectory would probably continue. And the chart on the right shows the type of feedstock that went into the mix in 2023. So this just illustrates my point about waste feedstocks being in high demand. So you can see that more than 70% of product used in the UK was UCO derived. A lot of it was palm oil derived, so 24% palm oil mill effluent, not pure palm oil, and then a couple of more niche waste feedstocks as well. But I think the really key point about that chart on the right hand side is all of those feedstocks are waste based, so there isn't any consumption of crop based biofuels in the UK, which I'll talk a bit more about palm oil at the end. But so just kind of important to note that pure palm oil isn't actually being used in the mix, but the waste products that come out of that process are being used. So I'll hand over to Geraint now and talk you through his experiences in a bit more detail.
Okay, good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for taking the time out to join us here today. My name is Geraint Davies, as has already been said. I am the FORS Concession Director, been in post for just over a year. Very different to my previous day job. I was working at John Raymond Transport for 22 years, owned by the Nolan Group, and I was there for a good while, good 22 years, and CEO when I finished. And part of my responsibilities at John Raymond Transport was to buy the fuel, and I did that for at least 20 years of that my time there. And I'm probably the first FORS concession director to have a Class 1 and a PSV, so I'd jump in the truck and all that sort of thing as well. And I've also served as a board director at the RHA, so I see things from that perspective. And I've also chaired the FTA, or Logistics UK as it's now called, UK Road Trade Council at Westminster. And I remember when we were having the first discussions on HVO going back probably 2018, something like that. So to set the scene in terms of fleet, circa 100 trucks, 44-ton Arctics, all doing curd insider work based at South Wales, Swindon and the Midlands. The work consisted of, it could be toilet paper, insulation, or beer, or anything that you would see on the shop floor in a supermarket, ambient, that so to speak. So the loads could be light-ish, with a full load of toilet paper when you cube out, or it could be heavy when you got to a 27, 28 ton of beer on the back of the trailer. So a good spread of work. In terms of fleet profile, we were asset based. We owned everything outright, the trucks and the trailers. And at the time I left, the newest trucks we had that we bought were 21 plate. They were a DAF, the last of the old DAF XF, and the Mercedes Actros. Now the older fleet as well, we'd had these from new, bearing in mind Volvo FHs and things like that, and we'd had them and maintained them ourselves right the way through their life. We had our own garage, so we were able to see things through an end-to-end process, and we even maintained all the newer stuff, the DAFs ourselves. The only thing that we didn't maintain ourselves was the Merc, and my biggest concern was for the older fleet when we were running on HVO, because they'd obviously been brought up on a diet of fossil diesel, and then to transition this older fleet, I was thinking I'm going to have problems with seals and injectors and pumps and so forth, because the new DAFs, it actually says on the tank that you can run it on various bio blends and HVO in the same. I can't remember what it said on the Merc, but I had confidence that I could do that. So my concern was with the older fleet. So I started. I used to buy all the fuel. Bit strange, really. Even on holiday, I'd be in a queue to go and look at dolphins on a boat or something with a family, and there's me buying tankers of diesel, thinking that's a normal thing to do. But looking back, it probably wasn't a normal thing to do. But running a haulage company is more of a lifestyle than a job, I suppose. But in that respect, I used to be very much in the moment, buying diesel and buying on the spot market and that sort of thing. And I had we had our own tanks in the yard, and we started off mixing it carefully just to see, and then increasing the blend as we went on. We had over the years quite a bit of experience, as Mike's already alluded to, with the biofuels. We've run up to a B12 blend, which means 12% of it was old-fashioned sort of trip fat type biofuel. Didn't have any real major problems, but we did have some issues with the tank at certain sites where you get the growth of sort of, I suppose you say, algae and bits and pieces, and you know, you'd have to get your pumps maintained more frequently and things like that. But HVO for us proved to be quite different. As Mike said, less NOx, and that's something that colleagues in the trade associations concur with as well. And yes, I did have a reduction in AdBlue, and I did see in the chat that somebody was asking what the reduction in AdBlue would be. A bit of a difficult thing to say, because the problem I had was at the time you couldn't get HVO up the road. So when probably 60-70% of the fleet were tramping, which means they were long distance fleet, you could fill up as best you can, and the emphasis was to always fill in the yards, but you couldn't account for, say, a truck going to Scotland and then doing a bit of a run around the north of England or something like that. At some point it's going to have to fill up the road. So there wasn't an exact science to it, but we did get 2 to 3% reduction in our operation, sometimes more. And then from my point of view, MPG did improve, but it was difficult to quantify fully because of, you know, that was across the board from not being on HVO to being on HVO. But it did run cleaner, and we didn't have any problems whatsoever. I was very nervous initially, and like I said, particularly with the older vehicles that had done up to 2 million Ks, that sort of thing, that we were going to have some issues. So it can be mixed with diesel, and that wasn't a problem whatsoever. And other things to consider as well, fuel surcharges. You know, you may have a customer with a fuel surcharge for HVO, and then a customer that hasn't. So how do you differentiate that fuel stock against another fuel stock, that sort of thing. And then it can actually help you win work. Now, I've seen customers take fleet, you know, I've seen it in the area here. Certain operators have lost work and operators have won work because that particular customer requires, and indeed their supply chain requires a demonstrable reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. So people have gone down the road of biomethane and LNG and things like that. And then there is no right answer. You know, it's horses for courses, or battery electric vehicles in certain applications. But of course, there's a cost to all this. You know, I know what the capex cost of one tractor unit is. You know, a tractor unit's gone up probably 40-50 grand in the last 2 or 3 years, and the trailer's probably gone up a good 10-20%, sometimes more. So there are pressures there. And then when you start talking about specialist vehicle architectures like battery electric vehicles and biomethane and things like that, you know, you're talking more. And this is the lowest of low-hanging fruit. You know, you can drop it in tomorrow into your trucks, and it does help you with the upcoming, well, the legislation is in now, and the upcoming legislation as well, and it is aligned with the FORS version 7 and things like that, which is another subject for another day. But it does demonstrate progress with customers as well, because it's not just about the rate anymore, it's about the what are you doing. And I had customers asking me, right, I want your well-to-wheel calcs tomorrow, sort of thing, because we're having an audit, and wanting your carbon and NOx and PM outputs and this sort of thing, which I was a FORS Gold operator, so I had that information to hand. But it's the pricing disparity is the other thing as well. It has narrowed, but I've seen it be as much as 40p a litre more than diesel, and of course somebody has got to pay for it, and we all know what the rates are like. So yeah, it's something to consider, through a fuel surcharge mechanism or something like that, with certain customers, that require it. But yeah, the disparity is getting less, so Mike, isn't it?
Yeah. So there's a chart further on in this that kind of shows just how much that difference has come down. So yeah, we'll certainly cover that in a bit.
and we'll talk about as well how RTFO that mechanism interacts with it as well. So yeah, so without further ado, I'll hand you back to Mike.
Thanks a lot, Geraint. That's great. So I'm just going to go into a little bit more detail on supply chain and pricing. So we'll go through kind of where the product comes from to begin with, and then obviously what are those delivery methods and how does that affect price. So I guess the first thing to mention here is that in terms of the actual production of HVO, UK production is really limited. So as things stand, there is only one operational facility, and that's the Humber refinery, operated by Phillips 66, which is producing HVO. But it's producing via a process called co-processing, which is effectively you're just processing your renewable feedstock alongside fossil fuel production. So it's not a dedicated facility, which means that the output is down compared to what you would get from a dedicated facility. So the upshot of that is that the UK is primarily an import market. And I've highlighted on the map here the kind of 3 key trading hubs, not just for HVO, but for all fuels in general. I'd say Europe and North America are probably the two key ones for the UK HVO market, but it's worth mentioning Asia as well, because there's a significant facility in Singapore. But in terms of the kind of key operators, names that you might have come across. So in Europe, and this is just purely by production capacity, so there are quite a few producers in Europe that I'm not going to mention, but in terms of the key players, you might have heard of Neste. So Neste developed the first dedicated HVO plant in Finland. They've also got another facility in Rotterdam now. So a lot of product actually comes through that. It's called the ARA trading hub, the Amsterdam, Rotterdam, Antwerp trading hub. So there's quite a lot of production and storage of HVO based there. North America. So I think before I go into the suppliers on North America, it's worth just raising the third point on this slide. So the UK is in a really interesting position in terms of supply chain compared to the rest of Europe. So the European Union has a countervailing duty policy on imports of US biofuels. So that means you basically pay extra tax on the import of US biofuels in Europe, and that's to protect the European biofuels market. So when the UK was a part of the European Union, we were subject to those countervailing duties. However, they were lifted a couple of years ago after Brexit, which has caused a bit of a shift in imports. So there are very few European countries that can actually access US products, and the UK is one of them. So it's kind of opened up this entirely new supply chain, which has obviously improved competition and therefore brought down prices in the UK. So there's quite a lot of US product coming in now. And the reason I wanted to mention that first is because the key producers, certainly on the Gulf Coast, so there's a company called Diamond Green Diesel, which has facilities in Texas and Louisiana. Diamond Green Diesel are a subsidiary of Valero, which operates the Pembroke refinery. So there's a lot of product coming from the US Gulf Coast into Wales, and then making its way around the rest of the country from there. So I think that's a really interesting kind of development over the last couple of years. In terms of other US production, so on the west coast, you've got Neste have got a facility that they've developed with Marathon, who are a US oil major. Phillips have got another facility in California as well. So there's quite a lot of production going on in the US at the moment. And then I mentioned Asia as well. So the key facility there is Neste have got a big facility in Singapore as well. So that's kind of an overview of where product is coming from. I would say it's primarily ARA and the US Gulf Coast. So this just gives you a bit of an example of an import supply chain. So your refinery, in this case, kind of represents a heifer facility, either in the US or in Northwest Europe. You get it tankered in to a coastal import terminal. And then so I'll kind of go over to the right hand side first. But the standard supply chain, I mean, it's very, very similar to that of fossil products, is secondary transportation. So you might get a fuel tanker that comes and picks it up from the import terminal, takes it to a secondary storage point. And I think that's probably quite important, because it means that there is the capability of having nationwide supply. So we're not just restricted to coastal import locations. There is HVO being stored in various nationwide storage terminals as well. And then you get to your kind of 3 delivery methods, which mirror that of diesel. So you've got bulk storage in tank. So that's a tank on site. You can access it via a card network, which I'll talk more on the next slide. But then also, it is being sold on retail forecourts as well. Not very many, but that is certainly part of the developing supply chain for HVO. But then you'll also see a direct link between the import terminal and the 3 kind of delivery methods, really, because if I take bulk supply as an example, and Geraint will have had experience of this when purchasing diesel. But if you're buying a full load 36,000 litre tanker from a major fuel seller, they might be lifting it direct from the import terminal or refinery, or depending on where your site's located, there might be a more beneficial regional storage point that they can source product from. The principles are the same for diesel and HVO. I think the point of this is that those are your 3 delivery methods, but there is, nationwide availability. It's just a little bit more limited when you're looking at things like card networks and retail forecourts. So in terms of cost and delivery methods in a bit more detail, there are a broad range of costs on this page. So I'll try and give you a little bit of context as to why that would be, but the first line pretty much sums it up. The price that you pay for HVO is going to vary significantly depending on the way that you're buying it, where you're buying it, and how much you require. So that final point is, if you're just buying the odd spot load of a couple of thousand litres, you're not going to get as competitive a price as if you're able to guarantee a significant volume that you're buying, more likely from a wholesaler, and therefore you'll be able to command a more competitive price. But in terms of your bulk supply to tank, this can range. These are obviously just estimated figures, but anything from between £1.20 to £1.50 a litre. So the lower end of that scale is going to be contracted fuel supply on a full load basis. So if there are any kind of larger operators on the call that have got contracted diesel supply, where you might have multiple locations and you're buying 36,000 litres at a time, you're more likely to be able to command a better price than, for example, smaller drops from regional distributors. That being said, you don't have to buy it in full loads. It's going to cost more, but you can get small load deliveries as well. And this works in a very similar kind of way to if we take maybe construction or agriculture as an example, where you might have lots of sites that require just a small amount put into mobile tanks and things like that. There are regional distributors that are geared up to do that, and they're able to buy from wholesalers, or they might even be importing it themselves, and therefore they can still offer you 500 litres to 1,000 litres of HVO dropped into a tank. It entirely depends on what your infrastructure is and what your fuel requirement is. But one of the questions that we had in kind of the build up to this is, is transitioning to HVO fleet size dependent? And my answer to that would be not really, but certainly your fleet size and your volume requirement will affect the way that you actually can have the fuel delivered. So we then move on to fuel card and retail. So done a little bit of research on card networks that are offering HVO coverage. So there are 2 independent card networks that a lot of fuel card users will be aware of. So that's UK Fuels and Key Fuels. They are offering limited HVO coverage on those networks, and they've got maps on their website, so you can go and see if there's one local to you. There's around 50 on the UK fuels network and about 30 on Key Fuels. You've then got distributors that supply HVO, like Certas, that have got their own network of bunker sites where they'll sell to HGVs via fuel card. And then you've got retailers as well. So BP, they're a big importer of HVO. They've obviously got a network of sites. You've then got Shell, Jet, so that's Phillips 66. I mentioned that they're a producer of HVO. So, you know, some Jet sites are selling it as well. And then you've got Esso, they're offering like a 25% HVO diesel blend. So there's quite a range of options in terms of your kind of retail coverage. I think one thing that I kind of just want to raise here is, firstly, prices can massively vary depending on where these sites are located and who is actually operating them. So we did a bit of research last week where we kind of went to a few different HVO retail sites to just kind of gauge what the prices were. And within a 70-mile kind of radius, there was a 30p variance in the price of HVO at the pump. And that's all to do with who is operating those pumps and, you know, their supply chains, you know, where are they able to source the HVO from. So that's one thing to be aware of, is that there is quite a lot of regional variance in price. And the other thing to be aware of is if you're looking at buying on a fuel card, so obviously you could go to a site that sells HVO and use your fuel card to actually pay for the product. However, it's similar to the way that things like petrol and AdBlue are priced on fuel cards, where they might be subject to surcharges, because card operators are geared up to sell diesel. They're not geared up to sell niche products, so they can often surcharge these more niche products. So you end up in if you paid for your HVO, for example, on a fuel card, you might end up paying a higher price than you would if you just paid with a credit card, because there's no surcharge on a credit card. You just pay the pump price. So the takeaway from that is, if you're considering using a fuel card to buy HVO on the network, check with your card provider how it's going to be priced first, and then at least you're going into it with open eyes. And then you've got just that last section, niche small load supply. So, you know, there are companies that will offer you just one-off IBCs, small packs of HVO. Clearly, they're not really a very sustainable long-term option if you want to get a competitive price. I mean, however, they do serve a purpose. You know, if you were just wanting to trial a vehicle to gauge things like performance and fuel economy, you know, you could just get a single IBC just for testing purposes, but you're likely to pay more than £2 a litre for that. So yeah, I'm now going to go into a bit more detail on contract pricing mechanisms.
Hi, Mike. I'm just going to quickly interject here.
Yeah.
We've got lots of great questions in the chat. I'm just mindful of the time. So it's 9:40, and because of how many questions we have, I think at least 10 minutes for Q&A time at the end. So just be mindful of that. Thank you, because we definitely want to answer as many questions as possible.
I think we've got 3 slides left, so I'll try and rattle through them.
Cool. Thank you.
So contract pricing, this is a bit of a text-heavy slide, and it is quite a complicated subject, so I'll try and keep it as brief as I can. But for those of you that buy diesel on a contract basis, you'll be familiar with the concept of wholesale plus or index linking, which is where you basically take the published wholesale price of diesel and add on your supplier margin, and that's how you calculate basically like a weekly price. There is a wholesale price for HVO, various wholesale prices for HVO. However, I would say it's fairly uncommon to index link to an HVO reference at the moment. There aren't that many suppliers that are offering that. So what you might get on a contract HVO basis is it might be a fixed premium or a variable premium above the price of diesel. So instead of it being diesel plus, you know, a couple of pence, it might be diesel plus, you know, 40p or whatever it is. I'll go on to that on the next slide. So that's an option. Or you might just get a short-term fixed price. So they'll say the price of HVO is £1.30 for the next 3 months, and then you just, you know, revisit it at the end of that fixed period. If a supplier is going to offer an index link on HVO, then it wouldn't work in the same way where you just take the wholesale cost of HVO and add on the supplier premium. And Geraint touched on this, but this is because of the way that HVO interacts with the renewable transport fuels obligation. Now, I could do a whole presentation on the RTFO itself, so I'm going to just try and summarize it in a couple of lines. But essentially, the RTFO says that a certain percentage of fuel supplied to the UK market must be made up of renewable fuels. So a supplier can do this by basically redeeming a certificate called an RTFC, and you either generate that certificate yourself by supplying biofuel, or you can buy it from somebody else that's supplied biofuel to the market. And this is really important for HVO, and particularly HVO derived from waste, so like a used cooking oil based HVO. So an HVO importer importing waste-based HVO would generate 2 RTFCs because it's double counted under the RTFO for every litre of HVO that they supply. And double counting is effectively a government incentive for using waste-based products. But because HVO isn't an obligated product, those certificates can be sold on to a fossil fuel supplier, right? So it's effectively a government incentive for the use of HVO because it offers fossil fuel suppliers a method to meet their obligation and generates a financial benefit for an HVO buyer. So I will show this on a chart and it will make a little bit more sense, but effectively the price of HVO in the UK, you can take the wholesale price minus the cost of the certificates that you would generate, and then you start adding on your supplier premium. So rather than a wholesale plus, it's like a wholesale minus RTFCs plus the additional costs. So as a result of these kind of moving dynamics, if you do get a premium against the price of diesel, then that is going to rise and fall based on what happens with the wholesale HVO market, but also what happens with these certificate prices. So I will show you on the chart and it will hopefully make a bit more sense. But this chart, basically start with the dark blue line at the bottom. I'll do the pointer if I can. So the dark blue chart at the bottom, line at the bottom is just the wholesale cost of diesel, inclusive of duty. So you can see it's around £1.10 at the moment per litre. The light blue line is the cost of wholesale HVO with UK duty added to it and no certificate benefit applied, right? So if you were to just take that without the certificate benefit, the price of HVO at the moment is about £1.50 wholesale. The dotted grey line shows the effective, well, this is the value of 2 certificates, so the effective benefit that you would get from importing and supplying HVO in certificates. So you can see there that that's about 40p at the moment. So the cost of a certificate is 20p. You get 2, so the benefit is therefore 40p. So you take the black line, therefore, is the cost of HVO with the RTFC benefit removed. So effectively that light blue line minus 40p. And you can see here, the really interesting thing is that on a wholesale basis, with the RTFCs removed, HVO and diesel are around parity at the moment. Now, a couple of caveats to this. Firstly, this chart assumes that 100% of that RTFC benefit is being passed through, which might not be the case because, you know, your HVO supplier might also be a fossil fuel supplier and they have an obligation that they need to hit. So they're using some of these certificates to meet their own obligation and therefore they're not selling them. So that's something to kind of bear in mind. And also these are wholesale prices. So you are going to expect to pay a premium on top of this depending on your supply method. And as we've just been through on the previous slide, that could be anything from 10p to, you know, 80p, depending on the way that you're buying it. And those premiums, if you were to compare them against diesel, because HVO is still a niche product, it's still an emerging market, you would expect those premiums to be higher than you're going to pay on diesel, just because it's not as developed a market. But yeah, hopefully this chart gives you a bit of insight into what Geraint was saying about the difference between HVO and diesel coming down. So you can see here, the black line and the blue line there was a much more significant difference a couple of months back, but in recent months that's really narrowed, and that's mainly due to the fact that RTFC prices have increased, so therefore the benefit has increased, and HVO wholesale prices have come down slightly as well. So a double kind of benefit there. So this is the last section and last slide, implementation. So just things to consider when you are considering transitioning to HVO. Just keep an eye on the time. I'm going to whiz through these really quickly. A lot of this is covering what we've already talked about. So left hand side, you've got your technical considerations. So things like, does your vehicle manufacturer approve the use of paraffinic diesel fuels, and will your supplier ensure that that fuel, the HVO supplied, will meet that specification? How cold's your storage going to be? That's something to bear in mind. How are you going to store it? And obviously, you've got your local availability. So your bulk supply, you will be able to find a solution pretty much anywhere in the country. It's obviously going to affect cost. But if you're buying on the forecourt, clearly that's all to do with how close is your local site. Product type. So got here feedstocks restrictions for either the client. So if you're moving to HVO for one specific contract, has your client said to you, we don't want anything to do with palm, even if it's a palm oil waste product, which is categorized as sustainable, we still don't want anything to do with it. So that means you would then have to go to your supplier and say, we cannot have any palm-based HVO in our supply chain. Can you guarantee that? Feedstock, as I mentioned, affects your GHG savings. So what is the minimum threshold that the supplier is offering? So they'll say, we'll supply you with HVO and we'll guarantee it'll meet a minimum of, could be 80%, for example, GHG savings versus diesel. Clearly, how's it going to be priced? And Geraint touched on this, but how are you then going to pass that through? So do you have a fuel surcharge mechanism that you can amend to meet HVO? And one thing that a lot of our clients have done is they'll take the difference between the cost of HVO and diesel, and then they'll share that between themselves and the client somehow. Could be a 50-50 or a different type of split, but some kind of cost share solution. And then in terms of the reporting considerations, so can your supplier prove the product's sustainability? So you get things called a POS, a proof of sustainability certificate, when you get a delivery of HVO. So can your supplier provide that? And that will tell you where it's come from, what the feedstock was, and importantly, that will enable you to calculate your GHG savings based on that POS. Mass balancing, it's a fairly simple approach, but basically this would mean that you might buy HVO, but your supplier still delivers diesel into your tank, but you're on the understanding that HVO is going into their supply chain somewhere else. So they're selling it to somebody else that's better located. You might be nowhere near any HVO supply infrastructure, and they might have another customer that is. So they take a mass balancing approach. And you need to ask yourself on your clients, is that acceptable? Because a lot of people want this fuel themselves to burn it, but ultimately, as long as it's going into the UK market, then a lot of people can be happy with a mass balance approach. You've then got your product's origin and how it made its way to the UK. So that will be covered in your POS, but that will affect things like calculating your scope 3 emissions. So scope 3 emissions is emissions as part of your supply chain from your suppliers. So that's obviously something to bear in mind. And then finally, there are accreditations that prove things around sustainability. So they prove that the supplier is meeting certain certain thresholds for sustainability. So the ISCC and the Renewable Fuels Assurance Scheme, which is operated by Zemo, they're two common supplier accreditations that you might see from HVO suppliers. I might have gone 1 minute over 10 to, but
that's okay.
Q&A.
Thank you, Mike. That was really great. If you stop sharing your screen, you should be able to see the chat function.
Yeah.
Cool. Thank you. We've got lots of great questions, and it's really nice to see everyone jumping in and, if they know the answer, replying. So I think we'll start with the one with the most likes, which comes from Sarah Mann. And you may have answered this, but you've answered where feedstocks come from, and she understands it's from other countries. However, because it's not in the UK, are we actually saving that much carbon if we have to transport it? Is essentially her question.
Yeah, so a lot of the figures that I've referenced in this presentation come from the DFT, and they actually show you where that feedstock has come from. And Sarah's right in saying that a lot of used cooking oil, for example, is coming from China. In terms of how to measure that, I think, as far as I'm aware, in terms of your proof of sustainability certificate, that would show you where the final product comes from, but it wouldn't necessarily show you where the feedstock itself comes from. So I guess that would be a question to put to the supplier, because they'll be more familiar with the supply chain. But yeah, it's absolutely a fair question, because if you are transporting it from the Far East, then clearly there are emissions attached to that supply chain. And you can look at all the data from the DFT. I've not included it in this presentation, but Holly, is the link going around? Because or the slides going around? Because there is a link on there that will take you to that data, and it'll show you exactly where the feedstock is coming from.
Yeah, I can circulate the slides. Everyone should also receive a recording of the webinar after it closes.
Cool.
Great.
Yeah.
I'll just go to one question, which is in the Q&A section, and then we can jump back to the chat. So will higher HVO usage in the UK increase the price of HVO?
So I think it would. I mean, there are kind of two ways to look at this. So the higher the demand, clearly standard supply and demand dynamics, if demand outweighs supply, then yes, it's going to make the product more expensive. However, when you've got an emerging product like HVO, you need that demand to stimulate production. So the more demand that we will have in the UK, the more likely that we'll get our own production facilities. And there are a couple that are slated for for development in the UK, which actually should that would bring the price down. I think the key thing that's in terms of looking at price dynamics is obviously the fact that we've now got these two markets available to us in the UK. We've got US and we've got Europe. So price, I think it will be brought down as more production comes on. But if the scales tip and demand starts to outweigh supply, then yes, you would see the price start to come back up. One question which we may get in the chat, I don't know, is feedstock availability. So there's been a lot of concerns about how much used cooking oil there is, because that's clearly the product that everybody's after. It already goes into first generation biodiesel. It can be used to make sustainable aviation fuel. There's a lot of demand for used cooking oil, and there's only so many burgers and chips that people are going to eat to create it. So that's clearly a key consideration. And it's hard to kind of cover this in such a short space of time, but what will likely happen is that producers will find alternative feedstocks to try and fill that gap. So there are already emerging technologies which use biomass feedstocks, which I've not gone into in this presentation because it's solely based on like heifer produced fuels. But that is certainly seen as the future of renewable diesel. Once we run out of used cooking oil and that kind of thing, we need biomass to step into that space. So yeah, sorry, that's a long answer, but there's a lot to go at in these topics.
That's okay. Yeah, I understand it's such a complex topic. I'm just going to put your contact details in the chat if anyone wants to get in touch. But if we don't have time to answer all the questions, we will get back to you via email. So Mike, we only have 5 minutes left, and Geraint, are there any questions you think will be really beneficial to answer on this call?
Yeah, so just looking at a lot of this, like I think there's been a couple of questions about UK produced used cooking oil and how that can go into the supply chain. So there are suppliers that are taking used cooking oil that's generated in the UK and turning that into biodiesel, because we do have biodiesel facilities here, but that's first generation biodiesel.
Yeah.
As I mentioned, there isn't a great deal of UK production of HVO. So what you'd have to have in that circular supply chain is somebody collects used cooking oil, sends it to a production facility, you know, in Europe, most likely. It's then turned into HVO and then it comes back. So it's quite a long circular supply chain. I guess that will come as and when the UK has a better sort of HVO production infrastructure. I'm just gonna.
In terms of fuel price points, I used to use various sources of intelligence, Portland Analytics, your company being one of them, and I used to sort of base my purchasing decisions on that intelligence and the weekly Platts price. Is there such a thing as a weekly Platts price for HVO?
So there, I mean, I'm sure Platts will have their HVO price. However, as I mentioned, it's more complicated than a standard HVO. HVO plus. We do, as part of our pricing service, the mechanism I explained where you take the wholesale price of HVO, net off the RTFCs. We do publish that daily on the pricing service. So yeah, I mean, absolutely. If anybody's interested in, you know, even just a demonstration of that service just to see how it works, then please drop me an email and I'll talk through it in a little bit more detail. I just wanted to, there's a question on why is it so expensive? We could talk about that for a long time, but just very kind of quickly to answer it. The price of HVO in Europe is basically, it's set by it's European demand, right? And in the UK, we have our biofuels targets, which can be met by just using first generation biodiesel. In Europe, the targets are much higher. You can't just meet it using first generation biodiesel. So you have to use a product like HVO to meet it. And that then increases demand for HVO, which pushes up the price of HVO. So actually, if you're looking at why is it so expensive versus, you know, diesel and that kind of thing, those two wholesale markets, it's all to do with compliance demand and how much it costs to be compliant in Europe. It's really interesting, but every European country has their own biofuels targets and a cost to meet that, and that's what really drives the cost of HVO in Europe.